Please give a warm welcome for our speaker today, Mr. Danny Thompson.
Thank you, bro. What are y'all doing here? I thought this room was gonna be empty as hell. I hope I don't disappoint, but if I do, Twitter will let me know. I'm pretty confident about it, Honestly, I'm really happy to be here. Number one, RenderATL, it's always one of my favorite conferences. I don't do a ton of conferences on purpose, but I always try to prioritize spending time here. So the fact that y'all are also here means a lot to me. Scott Talinsky's on stage, in case you don't know. So like, if you think about that and you start realizing maybe you know too much, that could be a great talk to listen to as well. Amazing human being. The whole focus today, every time I come to RenderATL, I make a brand new talk. And it's the first time I'm doing this. To be honest, I was very nervous about today's talk. Extremely so. I woke up at like 3 o'clock in the morning, had like 3 hours of sleep, and I literally rewrote the entire live coding portion right there. So it may crash and burn, we'll find out together. But the whole focus today, I got introduced to this tool recently, TanStack Query. It's an amazing tool. One of the biggest things about this is, honestly, if you're using Redux for state management, stop, y'all. It's 2023, we got better tools, we got better ways to do this. And one of the coolest things about utilizing other tools besides what we're used to, or especially if you're working on like some legacy code, is the migration to TanStack Query is probably one of the easiest you would ever utilize in a lot of scenarios. And so the whole focus today is kind of getting you understanding about that and getting you used to some of these things. My biggest goal is to kind of provide an actionable set of items that you can start doing, so that way after this, you could literally jot down some notes, and as soon as you touch a laptop, you can get in there. We're gonna kind of go over a few key things that we'll kind of go over. And so for me, especially when it comes to the item of TanStack Query, or I'll be honest, I call it React Query, and I'll explain why we call it TanStack Query in a moment. They changed the name. But everyone still kind of refers to it as React Query, especially if you're in the React ecosystem. And that's how I was introduced to it as well. But one of the biggest factors of why I like this is my whole specialty now has just revolved around sales funnels. I'm very focused when it comes to the user experience. I'm very focused on, especially when you're talking about a sales funnel, you have a customer that's literally willing to spend their hard-earned money with whatever it is that you're providing them. It's almost a duty and a responsibility to make that the smoothest process possible, while also thinking about how are you increasing their experience, making sure it's smooth, but also making sure that they trust what it is that they're doing. This tool kind of does that. Now, oftentimes when I think about doing things for user experience, that stage scares the hell out of me. When I think about things for user experience, I often think like, now I have extra work to do. I have extra load to bear. How am I gonna handle all this new stuff? That's why I started, especially lately in my career, I've started looking at what are things that I can do that, or utilize, that have increased the developer experience and made the tool better for the developers that's utilizing it. This is actually one of those tools that prioritize user experience while also highly prioritizing the developer experience. It makes so many difficult tasks very easy. I truly feel like Tanner, when he created this, said, I know what I need to do, I just need this to do the thing without me having to write 10,000 lines of code to make that happen. So we're gonna kind of go over that. The key takeaways, this is my key takeaway list and my hope of what you'll get out of the end of this. You're gonna understand what TanStack Query is and the benefits of it. You're gonna understand how to use queries. You'll understand a lot more about data fetching if that's something that's completely foreign to you. You'll understand a little bit about refetching as well as mutation, which is a big aspect here, and cache invalidation. Now, one of the key things here, because sometimes when I talk to developers, they don't truly understand how browser caching fully works, or it's not something that they constantly utilize. It's not even top of mind for a lot of folks. And one of the cool things about this is you can actually utilize this really well, even if you're not the most well-versed in that subject. So hopefully, if you're not, show of hands, anybody not super knowledgeable on browser caching? Okay, yeah, I figured. I was the same way, like it's not at the forefront of a lot of conversations. Little about me, and just in case you don't know who I am, I'm Danny Thompson. I'm a software developer currently at AutoZone. I'm not here representing the company. It's me, I'm just here because I love Render. And I'm a community builder. I've built several communities around, I started GDG Memphis. I currently am working with a bunch of volunteers. We do Dallas software developers. We've built an amazing community there. It's my second year speaking at Render. Hopefully it goes well. Maybe I'll come back for a third. And I've recently relaunched the Commit Your Code podcast, which is a great format. If you want to be a guest on it, let me know and all that good stuff. But if you want an interesting podcast to check out, it's kind of a different format than I've ever seen done on another podcast. It could be interesting for some. All right, what's TanStat Query? Now, I already saw the light glimmer. That photo is amazing, I know. But the TanStat Query in general, what is it? We've kind of talked about a little bit of it, but let's get down into the details. TanStat Query is a state management tool that requires 0 dependencies. This is one of the biggest factors and biggest add-ons about this. You don't need a ton of dependencies or a ton of tools to make this operate at its full capacity. Like, you can totally get this running, oftentimes only needing 3 NPM installs. So, and the reason why I say 3, you could get it done with 1, you could get it done with 2. I kind of have a couple benefits with all 3 that I'm going to kind of go over, and hopefully it'll really matter to you. And so one thing that I heard, which is what really made this click for me, is Tanner said this in a talk early in the building of this, and he said there's a difference in state. It's not just one global store that we kind of store everything in, that which is kind of the default with Redux. You have your client-side state, but also you have server-side state. And so when you start separating it, it started making things click for me a little. So that's why I wanted to kind of share that early to see if you start piecing a lot of this together. So on client side, you can prefetch the data yourself, or you can prefetch the queries on the server, dehydrate the cache, and then rehydrate it on the client side. React Query is one big factor for me. It's very good about not telling you how you must do things. It has no clue how you're fetching things. It has no, it doesn't care if you're using Axios or Fetch or anything else. It only cares about the information that you're sharing and how you're going to end up utilizing it. So it doesn't dictate what you must be doing. I think that's a really good value add. And you can use Postgres, you can use things like that. You can architect it the way that you need it to work. And I think that's a really big value add as well. The only thing that you need to really worry about is how you're going to be manipulating that data. So and one thing is, like I said, I woke up at 3 o'clock, and so I started changing some things. In my sleep-deprived state, I added some jokes. So bear with me on this one. Why did the React Query developer break up with his partner? Because it didn't even know the dependencies. It didn't need them. All right, so what's state management? Let's break this down. The data of an application will determine how the application works and the info it outputs. State management is managing of the current values of various variables, data structures, etc. Some examples to kind of make this understandable for some that you could be utilizing this for: form handling, shopping carts, users logged in. Like, these are great examples of why you'd really be wanting to think about that state management at that time. One really interesting thing, especially with TanStack, is it follows stale while revalidate logic. So one thing in particular about this, and this is what really kind of drew me to this, Tanner, when he built this tool set, right, and I keep mentioning him because obviously he created it, but I think the need is what kind of got me into it as well. He didn't just build this because he's like, I'm the greatest genius in the world when it comes to state management. He had a company that he was doing, he had a startup, and he had problems that he needed to solve. And through that, he started developing this tool to perform a lot of those actions. And as he shared it publicly, more people got involved and interested in it and became this amazing open source initiative. But to me, that made a lot of sense. Like, oftentimes we have individual problems and we're like, okay, we'll make a compromise or we'll try and string together something here and there. But when you find something that a lot of people are resonating with, and at that time, especially when state management wasn't necessarily like the biggest talked about thing, we just kind of dealt with it. It was the perfect tool at that time, and I still utilize it to this day. And so when we talk about stale while revalidating, right, one of the biggest factors here is every single time, if you're not utilizing cache, for example, every time you're trying to get new data, you're making a brand new API request, you're getting new data at that time. If your user is waiting there, they're going to be waiting, see maybe a loading screen, and especially if we're talking like developing world countries where the internet's not as fast, that may be a lot longer of a process than you'd want your customer to wait. This kind of helps mitigate a lot of those problems. So what are some of the biggest advantages of TanStack Query? I jotted them down so that way it's like really easy to kind of go through, right? Let me get some water real fast. I know some of y'all like, just keep speaking. I got you, 1 second. And before I get into that, Why did the React query cache get a promotion? Because it's always had the freshest data in the office. All right, so stale while revalidate. Serving users information as up to date as possible, but cached. It will serve the cache version while it refetches what's needed, okay? I think that's huge. Now, there's multiple ways that you can refetch that data. You can actually set up cache times. So you can say after X amount of minutes, X amount of seconds, make another request. So you don't have to do it every single time someone changes the page. Or if you really wanted it to be the most up-to-date information humanly possible, you can actually set it up to anytime the browser's on focus, we get that information. And it'll refetch it for you without you having to go through a manual process of calling it. It'll just do that automatically, which I think is fantastic. You can disable that whatever you want. It's like a one-line thing to enable or disable, so it's not a huge thing there. I have like a little bit of live code that we'll go through so you can kind of see that. But super value add. One of the biggest focuses, especially on the cache time, this is actually preventing extra API calls. So if you're preventing them now, and let's say you have maybe a smaller plan with the API service, this can help mitigate extra calls that may be costing you a lot of money down the road. Especially when we're talking bigger services that may have more than a handful of users, it could be a huge value add for a lot of organizations. Now, prefetching data. Prefetching data, maybe you already know what a lot of the data is that your users are going to need. Instead of making that API request after they get to that point, you can prefetch it and have it cached and served, ready to go. So it's almost an instantaneous experience for the user, as opposed to them waiting for possibly through another load state. Ease of use, super easy to use. It's very easy to use, very easy to get set up with. To be completely honest with you, their documentation is probably one of the best around, and they have great examples in there as well. So it's really easy to follow along. And to be honest, I get most people up and running in almost no time. You'd be completely shocked at how quickly you can adopt it. And I think it's because of no needed extra dependencies. You could just literally copy some of what's in the documentation right now, and it'll be up and running in most use cases. Query deduplication. So we're not calling extra API calls. You can actually limit some of the API calls that are happening, especially when we're talking about like cache timing. That could be a great way to limit a lot of that as well. Automatic caching, kind of what I said earlier. If you're not the most intelligent or well-versed individual when it comes to browser caching and things like that, it's doing that a lot for you already, out of the box. So you can tweak that however you need, but it's literally saving all that information for you and serving it. And one great thing about that is it will check if new information is available without requiring you to get involved in that process. And in doing so, it guarantees that, hey, whatever you have is the most current, or we'll serve this cache version as we pull that new information, and then we serve that behind it, making a better experience for the user altogether. One cool thing as well, they have, and we kind of already talked about stale while we validate, but they have some amazing dev tools that we'll also see during the live coding portion. And what's cool about that is instead of having to go through external resources or external components, you can see all the information live on the bottom, especially during dev time. I think that's extremely helpful. They also have something that I call convenient hooks. They have some of the most convenient hooks around to do a lot of these items. Like prime example, the use query hook that we'll be going over today, or the use mutation hook, even pagination. Sometimes to implement pagination requires a lot of code depending on what you're doing. It's very simple to utilize pagination through the React query process. So to me, that's a big value add, especially because I actually had to do something very similar not too long ago before I knew about this. And when I saw the difference, like that would have saved me so much time. And I think that's something that a lot of people can get benefit through. Error handling. One of the coolest things about React query is and we'll kind of see this later on, but you'll actually have multiple items that you can pull out of a use query. And so you can pull out certain things like, and we can go to this next slide to kind of see that happening right now, actually. How to query. And you see here, we have several things in this code. We have is loading. We have the data itself. We have is error, which is the error handling. And we have is fetching. So I can now have 4 different use cases. There's many more as well. But if there's an error that happens, I don't need to think about every single error use case. It'll provide me the actual error message through that is error. So I could just literally do is error.message, and it will show me, hey, something's wrong here. Or if is error is there with the Boolean, I can now return an error of my own saying, oh, something messed up, giving that valuable information to the user at that time to have more trust in the process. I'm very big about the fact that a lot of trust isn't just built on a great application, but it's relevant information given at those relevant times. And if something goes wrong and we're not necessarily letting the user know something happened, they may feel less secure in our products. One prime example of that, banking applications. If I go to my online bank and I see all my things say $0, that's gonna be a problem for me, right? Where's my money at? That's not a thing that I'll wait till tomorrow to find out. That's like, I'm picking up the phone right away, what happened to my cash? But if they had some kind of message there saying, hey, API error request went invalid, just refresh this page, you'll be good. That would make me feel way more comfortable in the process. Refresh the page, I won't freak out, won't have to call customer service. This is a prime example of utilizing that for the right reason. Is loading state. Most applications, you're gonna have something there, whether it's like a spinning circle, something to let the user know, hey, it's taking a moment, right? So if it's still in that is loading state, I can provide a message, I can provide some customization if I want to, whatever it is that I want to do, but that will provide that right there, and that's straight out of the box with use query. I don't have to do anything additional. It's just one variable that I pull out there and I provide it somewhere else. The data itself, obviously we need that. And so with going through that, we have here our query key, which we're calling in this situation repo data, and we have our query function, and we have our, since I'm using Axios, I'm using a random API to generate some products, and that will be utilized in the examples that we have going on after this. And so just like that, it doesn't matter if I'm using Axios, get, whatever, or fetch, whatever it may be, it doesn't necessarily care about the method of what I'm doing, it just cares about the data that it's getting back, so that way we can start manipulating it. So a query is a way to fetch data from an API or an external resource, like a database. It is a declarative way to fetch the data. How to use query? The use query hook. The hook needs a query key and a function, and there's optional items that you can add as well, such as is error and things like that, that can kind of make this experience a lot better for others. And now we're starting to get into other areas, mutations. This is where it starts getting a little bit more advanced, but this is like where it really starts truly becoming a very valuable tool for a lot of developers. Mutations update the data in the cache and are typically used for like CRUD operations, like CRUD actions, so, or performing actions server-side. So TK Dodo, who's one of the main maintainers for React Query, or TanStack Query, he actually described mutations as, and this was a direct quote from him, generally speaking, mutations are functions that have a side effect. And so states, a mutation can only be in one of the following states at any given time versus multiple. So is idle, is pending, which is like version 5 came out, is error, or is success. And because of that, after mutation completed, when use mutation completes, it will trigger a refetch by invalidating the use query cache and getting you the latest information. So again, as we see in this use mutation, there's not a lot that you have to do to make this happen, right? We're talking literally 5 lines of code. So our return is a use mutation. We have our mutation function. In this example, I'm doing something for like an employee card item on a website. Try to use like real use cases. And so I'm using another random API there where we have a new employee. And on the success, once that mutation is successful, I want to invalidate the query, and I'm passing in the array of queries there to the query client. So now it'll bring me all that brand new information and things like that. So invalidating cache and cache invalidation. So invalidating cache is easier to do with React Query, but knowing when to do it is actually the challenge for a lot of people. So I try to give an example, and before I give that example, why did the React Query hook go to the therapist? Because it was always invalidating itself and needed some self-validation instead. I know I'm funny, I know. Oh, that one went slide too fast. All right, so what's a great example and a great time where someone can invalidate the cache? CRUD operations are a prime example. You're creating, updating, deleting records. Think about it. That's probably one of the most important times, especially for the user, that they have up-to-date information. Especially if they're invalidating their own records, they want to see that it was done. Did they add something to their membership? Maybe they added a family member. They need to be able to see that the family member's there right away. They don't need to see the cached version where it's just them, because what happens? They go through the entire process again. Now you have duplicate records, you have information you probably don't necessarily need at that time. This would save both of y'all a lot of headache. Because now, if they go to customer service and it's a whole thing, and then you know how customer service is, they don't ask the details. They're like, I didn't find out what browser it was, I didn't find out what version it was, I didn't know. They just said it didn't work, go figure it out. And now you're on a wild goose chase. This would solve a lot of those problems. So that's a great example and time when you'd want to have an invalidated cache for the up-to-date results. Especially if we're talking about, let's say, maybe you have a cache time of 5 minutes. 5 minutes for a user that's looking for that immediate response would be a very long time for them to be content waiting for that. And I got a twofer for you. How does the React query dev deal with being rejected for things? It doesn't take it personally. It just invalidates the issues and tries again. That was actually inspired by a conversation I had this morning, by the way. Just saying. So now kind of going into that, I'm going to come over here, and I have only a few more minutes, but I kind of want to go through this code, and it's not on my screen, so we're going to kind of go through this one together. But to give you an idea, I'm kind of going through some things here, and so just a very simple application, and I'll actually show you what it's looking like. I actually literally rewrote it this morning because I felt like it wasn't serving the purpose that it needed. So we're just using a random mock API for some products, has some basic information. You can customize this however you'd want. That wasn't really the focus for this. But the idea is if a customer is now on here, right? And so let's say they were to click this button, maybe they want to buy more, they wanted some more product details. They go to it, there's the React query tools that I was telling you about. So we have all this information kind of being shared there. So it tells me everything that's kind of going on. But if you saw for a moment, and this can kind of be minimized but just by hitting that icon, but if you saw, there was a loading state that happened, right? So as it's going here, it's loading because it's refetching that data for me, and it provides that. Now, if I were to go back to any of the two products that I just selected, we no longer see a loading state. It's serving that cached version. So now, especially as a user, let's say I'm shopping for some items. I want some details. That item product is not going to change in 30 seconds or a minute. So it's a great use case for me to have that cache detail there. And as they're browsing and perusing and maybe loading up a cart with other items, I can have that already served, so I'm not making extra API calls to get all the information at that time. And it's saving me a lot, because think about it. We all window shop, right? So like as you're just randomly clicking along, I don't need to have 50 API calls for one customer at that time. I can have probably 5 or 6 and have all that data served at that time and provide it to that user. It's gonna be very useful. So the use case there is pretty incredible. And even here, like we see all these products, right? So it's like multiple products on here. I think it's like 30 or 40. And so as I'm going through it, if I'm just going back, it's not even gonna time out when it's like 3 or 4 products, because if I were to go back to this, we're still serving that state. So it kind of helps out in that regard. One of the big things here, by the way, is if you noticed, a lot of the, well, maybe if you didn't notice, a lot of the terminology that I've been using has really been focused on version 4. As of last week, version 5 is now out. After consulting with TK Dota himself, he said it would probably be best to advise people on version 4 because it's probably the most stable version right now. But there's some terms that I kind of put in there, like is pending, for example, is something directly out of version 5. They definitely made things even more easier in version 5 and a lot more customizable as well for you. But I would highly advise you to start out on version 4. You can experiment with version 5, but especially if this is something that you're trying to use in a slightly bigger project outside of something on the side, I'd be sticking with version 4 for now before version 5 starts taking over. And because that's cool, one of the coolest things about TanStack Query in particular is regardless of your versioning, you could still utilize it however you see fit. Because again, they don't want to kind of dictate things to you. And shout out here to the API that I'm using. Just I don't make nothing from it, but this is the API that I use. So if you're interested in it, knock yourself out. It's free, and you could buy them a coffee, which I did because I'm using it for the talk. But overall, like hopefully this kind of helps you out and all the good stuff. And honestly, at the very least, if state management wasn't necessarily on your radar, it could be something that you're now thinking about and hopefully utilizing that to your advantage. And the last thing that I would go to is honestly, and I won't even put the slide up because that's gonna be way too much work, I'm gonna be real. But I just wanna thank you. It's telling me thank you, but it's to you as well. Now that your life has become easier because of TanStack Query, you now have extra time to go learn advanced generic patterns in TypeScript. Yay. Everybody gets excited about that. But outside of that, I'm Danny Thompson. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope I don't get too many angry tweets, but I'm sure there'll be some. But until then, I'll see you on the next one.